The plane incident. Claudia's heart raced as she rummaged through her backpack for the last time. The anticipation of her first holiday trip with Martin had her buzzing with excitement. At 20, she had her whole life ahead of her, filled with the promise of love, adventure, and the warmth of the tropical sun. She was a cute, slightly disorganized medical student whose brown eyes sparkled with enthusiasm whenever she talked about her future with Martin, a well-built young man with a gentle smile and the same dreams of saving lives. Her father's voice echoed through the house, a reminder of the ticking clock. "Are you still packing?" he called out, a hint of exasperation in his tone. She knew he was worried about her, but she couldn't help feeling a twinge of irritation at his impatience. "Yes, Pa, I'm almost ready," she shouted back, her voice carrying the weight of a million unspoken reassurances. She had packed and repacked her bag countless times, making sure she had everything she needed for their getaway. Finally, with her suitcase zipped and her passport tucked safely in the pocket of her backpack, Claudia descended the stairs, her excitement bubbling over despite the time crunch. Her mother stood in the doorway, her eyes misty with a mix of pride and concern. They shared a warm embrace, her mother whispering a soft, "Be safe, my love," into her ear. As her father loaded their luggage into the car, Claudia took a moment to appreciate the comfort of her childhood home one last time before the grand adventure ahead. The drive to the airport was a blur of traffic and nerves. Claudia's father, a man of few words, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. He had always been the protector of the family, and letting his little girl go on her first trip without him was clearly taking a toll. His occasional glances in the rearview mirror were filled with unspoken instructions and silent prayers for her safety. As they pulled up to the terminal, Claudia's mother leaned over and squeezed her hand. "Remember to enjoy every moment, darling," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And don't forget to apply sunscreen." Claudia couldn't help but laugh at her mother's practical advice, even in the face of their rushed goodbye. With a final kiss, she grabbed her suitcase and dashed into the airport, her heart racing with excitement. Inside, the chaos of the terminal was a stark contrast to the quiet calmness of her home. She scanned the sea of faces, looking for the one she knew so well. And there he was, her knight in shining armor, his eyes scanning the crowd for her. Martin's face broke into a wide grin when he spotted her, the tension of the last few hours melting away. He was already at the airport, his nerves wound tight as a spring because of her usual punctuality issues. But when he saw her, all was right with the world again. They embraced, and for a moment, all the worries of the day were forgotten. "Come on, we can't be late for this," he said, his voice a mix of urgency and relief. They sprinted to the baggage service desk, dodging trolleys and weaving through the throngs of travelers. After a flurry of activity, their suitcases were checked in and their boarding passes in hand. They dashed to the passport control checkpoint, breathless and laughing, their hearts pounding from the adrenaline rush. The line was surprisingly short, and soon they were through, hand in hand, racing to their boarding gate. The digital display flashed an orange final call for their flight. The urgency in their steps grew as they approached the gate, and the tension in the air thickened. The flight attendant gave them a stern look but allowed them to board. They settled into their seats, the leather upholstery cool against their overheated skin, and the plane began to taxi towards the runway. The engine's roar grew louder, and Claudia felt the familiar thrill of takeoff, the excitement of leaving the ordinary behind. As they ascended, the city below grew smaller and smaller until it was just a sprawling patchwork of lights. The aircraft leveled out, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Cabin crew, ready for takeoff." Claudia couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. She leaned over to Martin, her eyes shining. "That's it! Here we come!" He chuckled, his hand squeezing hers reassuringly, and nodded. The plane's acceleration was smooth and steady, pressing them back into their seats as they climbed higher and higher. Through the small oval window, the world grew distant, swallowed by the vastness of the sky. The cabin crew began their meticulous dance, pushing carts down the narrow aisles, serving drinks and snacks with practiced smiles. Claudia took a sip of her complimentary cola, the bubbles fizzing in her nose. Martin nibbled on a pack of peanuts, his eyes never leaving hers. They felt like the only two people in the world, their love a warm cocoon around them as the aircraft sliced through the clouds. Eventually, Claudia felt the call of nature. "I'll be right back," she whispered to Martin, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. He nodded, his gaze returning to the in-flight magazine. The bathroom was occupied, but she waited patiently, her thoughts swirling with excitement about their upcoming holiday. When the door finally opened, she stepped inside, the cold air a welcome relief from the cabin's stuffiness. The bathroom was small and gleaming white, with a faint scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. As she washed her hands, she noticed the mirror had fogged up slightly. Wiping it clean with a towel, she studied her reflection. She looked tired but happy, her eyes bright with excitement. The light fog outside the bathroom had dissipated, but she could still see it hugging the cabin floor in the distance. It was strange, but she dismissed it, thinking it was just condensation from the air conditioning. When she returned to her seat, Martin was tense, his eyes flicking from the cabin crew to the cockpit door. "What's going on?" she whispered, sliding into her seat and buckling up. Two flight attendants went to check on something downstairs, and now everyone's looking for them. His voice was low, and she could feel the fear simmering beneath his words. The fog in the cabin grew denser, creeping closer to them. The whispers grew louder, the tension palpable. Claudia's mind raced, trying to piece together what could be happening. The sight of the fog from the bathroom earlier played in her mind like a horror movie scene. "That weird mist I saw earlier, do you think it has something to do with this?" she asked Martin, her voice quivering. He nodded, his eyes wide with concern. "It's definitely not normal." A sudden jolt of the plane brought the passengers' attention back to reality. The captain's voice, strained and shaky, crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The words were comforting, but the chaos outside the cockpit suggested something much more sinister was afoot. The co-pilot and a second flight attendant had volunteered to search for the missing crew members. They stepped into the cabin elevator, its doors closing with a reassuring click. Claudia watched as the elevator descended, feeling a strange mix of fear and anticipation. Martin took her hand, his grip tight. "We're going to get through this," he murmured, trying to calm her. But moments later, a piercing scream echoed from below, followed by a thud and the elevator jolting to a stop. The cabin lights flickered and the passengers gasped. The elevator doors remained shut, the quiet only broken by the occasional whine of the stalled motor. The remaining flight attendant looked at them, her face pale. "It's not safe. We need to get ready to land." The passengers, now fully aware of the horror lurking in the plane's bowels, were a mix of shock and panic. The fog grew thicker, tendrils of it reaching into the cabin, brushing against the seats and legs of the uninformed. The smell of fear filled the air, a heady scent that seemed to thicken the very air. The third flight attendant, a young woman named Laura, staggered out of the elevator, her eyes wide with terror and pain. She had been slashed by something sharp, something that had left deep gashes across her neck and stomach. Blood soaked her uniform and her trembling hands pressed against her wounds, trying to stem the flow. The passengers' cries grew louder, and the remaining flight attendants struggled to keep order. Laura managed to whisper something to her colleagues before collapsing in a heap on the floor. The captain's voice boomed through the intercom. "Everyone, remain calm. We need a doctor or medical personnel on board immediately. This is a medical emergency." The cabin was a cacophony of fearful murmurs and gasps. Claudia felt a cold hand of dread tighten around her heart as she realized the gravity of the situation. She had been in medical emergencies before, but never in a confined space miles above the earth with nowhere to run. Martin, his face paler than the moonlit clouds outside the window, raised his hand. "I'm a medical student," he called out, his voice surprisingly steady. The flight attendant's gaze darted to him, and she gestured for him and Claudia to follow her to the front. Laura, another injured flight attendant, emerges from the elevator and whispers something before collapsing, prompting the captain to call for medical assistance. Despite his fear, Martin, a medical student, steps up to help, and he and Claudia are led to the front of the cabin to assist the crew. Laura's condition highlights the severity of the situation as the plane continues to deal with the unexplained fog and the missing crew members. As they approached Laura's lifeless body, Claudia's stomach churned at the sight of her ravaged neck and stomach. The wounds were indeed reminiscent of an animal attack, but the precision and depth suggested something much more sinister. Martin took a deep breath and bent down, his hands visibly shaking as he examined the injuries. He looked up at Claudia, his eyes reflecting the horror they both felt. "It's not a dog or wolf," he whispered. "It's something inhuman." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, this time more urgent than before. "We need 2 passengers to assist us in finding our missing crew members. We believe they may be in trouble. Please come to the cockpit immediately." The cabin fell silent, except for the quiet sobbing of a few passengers. 2 men, both looking paler than the airplane's interior, slowly stood up and made their way forward. The first was a burly man in his 40s named Joe, who worked as a security guard in his daily life. The second was a young, lean university student named Daniel, who had a survivalist streak and had always dreamed of being a hero. They looked at each other with a mix of terror and determination. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Samira, handed them each a flashlight. "Remember, we don't know what's down there. Stick together and be careful." She turned to Martin and Claudia, her expression tight with anxiety. "If you hear anything at all, you stay here and don't move. Do you understand?" They both nodded solemnly. Joe and Daniel, the two male volunteers, stepped into the elevator with Samira. The doors slid shut with a hiss, and the three descended into the murky depths of the aircraft's lower level. The tension was palpable as they reached the bottom. The elevator doors opened to reveal a thick, swirling fog that danced in the beams of their flashlights. Samira took a deep breath and cautiously stepped out. The men followed close behind her, their eyes darting around the shadowy storage area. "Keep your lights on the fog," Samira instructed, her voice shaking slightly. "Whatever you do, don't let it touch you." The trio moved through the cargo hold, their flashlights cutting through the mist. The floor was cold and damp, making their steps echo through the eerie silence. Suddenly, the elevator started to ascend again, leaving them isolated in the creepy fog. Samira's panic grew more pronounced, her voice strained as she shouted, "Don't go near it!" As the fog grew denser, Joe and Daniel felt a sense of dread wash over them. They heard strange noises in the distance, whispers and guttural growls that seemed to come from within the mist itself. The sounds grew louder as they approached the source, their hearts racing with every step. The fog thickened to the point where they could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. Martin's words echoed in their minds, poisonous, deadly. Suddenly, Samira's scream pierced the quiet. "Look out behind you," she yelled. The two men spun around, their flashlights jerking in every direction, but it was too late. The first missing attendant emerged from the murk, her once beautiful features twisted into a grotesque mask of rage and hunger. She lunged at Daniel with inhuman speed, her fingers elongating into claws that dug into his neck and ripped away his flesh in one swift motion. Daniel's eyes went wide with shock and pain, then glazed over as life drained from his body. Joe stood paralyzed with horror as he watched his friend's lifeless body hit the floor. The zombified attendant turned to him, yellow eyes gleaming through the fog. He backpedaled, slipping on the slick surface as he tried to evade her. The other missing flight attendant appeared, moving with an unnatural grace despite the grisly wounds that marred her form. Samira, from her vantage point in the elevator, could only watch in horror as the scene unfolded. She knew she had to act. The zombie-like attendant was on Joe, her teeth sunk into his shoulder. He screamed in agony as she ripped away a chunk of flesh. Martin grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher and swung it with all his might, connecting with the creature's skull. The impact sent her stumbling back, momentarily stunning her. Joe took the opportunity to break free, blood spurting from his wound. He stumbled towards the elevator, collapsing just as the doors opened. Claudia caught him and dragged him inside, slamming the doors shut just as the other zombified flight attendant reached for them. The elevator jolted back up to the main cabin floor. The surviving passengers had barricaded themselves using luggage and seats. The fog had spread throughout the plane, turning the cabin into a macabre maze. The undead co-pilot had made his way to the flight deck, leaving a trail of carnage. The captain, now a panic-stricken shell of his former self, was frantically trying to radio for help, his eyes darting between the instruments and the fog-covered window. The elevator doors opened and Claudia and Martin rushed out with Joe's limp body in tow. The remaining passengers saw their hope in the couple's medical expertise and begged for assistance. Claudia quickly assessed Joe's wound and applied pressure to stop the bleeding while Martin took charge of the group. "We need to get everyone to the cockpit," he announced, his voice steady despite his fear. "It's our best chance for survival." As they moved through the cabin, the fog grew denser and the groans of the undead grew louder. The passengers formed a protective barricade around Claudia and Joe, using their bodies to shield them from the horrors lurking in the mist. Martin took the lead, his flashlight piercing the darkness as he searched for the cockpit. They stumbled upon the first of their fallen, a passenger torn apart and reanimated by the fog's malevolent influence. Martin steeled himself and swung the fire extinguisher, taking the creature down with a sickening crunch. The group moved as quickly as they could, adrenaline masking their exhaustion and fear. Each step brought them closer to the cockpit, but also closer to the heart of the chaos. They could hear the captain's desperate cries for help, muffled by the thickening fog. As they approached, the door to the flight deck burst open, and the zombie co-pilot stumbled out, his eyes locked onto them. Martin didn't hesitate. He charged forward, delivering a blow that sent the creature reeling back into the cockpit. The passengers followed, sealing themselves inside. The captain was a mess, his eyes wild with terror. "They're everywhere," he stammered. "I don't know what happened to the others." Claudia took over the radio, trying to communicate with ground control, but all she heard was static. "We're on our own," she murmured to Martin, who nodded solemnly. They had to figure out a plan before the zombies broke through their makeshift barricade. While Claudia tended to Joe's injuries, Martin studied the flight manual, desperately searching for an emergency protocol that could save them. The minutes ticked by like hours as they listened to the horrific sounds outside the cockpit door. The groans grew closer, and the thumps of fists against the metal grew louder. They knew their time was running out. "We have to find a way to land this plane," Martin said, his voice a mix of determination and dread. Claudia looked at him, her eyes wide with fear but also a spark of hope. "I'll do everything I can to help," she replied, taking a deep breath to steady her trembling hands. They turned to the captain, who was frantically pushing buttons and flipping switches. "We're losing altitude," he yelled over the intercom, "and I don't know why." Martin, with his medical knowledge, knew that the elevator incident must have caused significant damage to the plane's systems. The captain looked up at them, his eyes pleading for guidance. "We need to find a place to land, now." The three of them worked in a frenzied harmony, Claudia navigating and providing medical support to Joe, while Martin assisted the captain with the flight controls. The fog had engulfed the cabin, making it almost impossible to see outside. The captain managed to get the radio to work long enough to broadcast a Mayday signal. The response was a garbled message about an emergency landing site, but the connection was lost before they could get the details. With the zombies banging relentlessly on the cockpit door, the pressure was on. Martin took charge of the situation, instructing the captain to keep the plane stable as he and Claudia prepared for the worst-case scenario. They grabbed whatever they could find as weapons and made a makeshift barricade. The door began to give way, and the captain shouted for them to brace themselves. The zombies burst through, their grotesque forms silhouetted against the foggy backdrop of the cabin. Martin and Claudia, armed with a fire extinguisher and a crowbar, fought valiantly. The first few were taken down with swift, hard blows, but more kept coming. The adrenaline surging through their veins, they managed to hold them back, but the struggle was taking a toll on their exhausted bodies. In the chaos, Joe, now semi-conscious, mumbled something about the oxygen masks. Claudia's mind raced back to the flight safety instructions they had ignored at the beginning of their trip. "The oxygen!" she exclaimed to Martin, who nodded in understanding. They had to get the masks to the passengers before the cabin pressure dropped too low. Grabbing the captain's radio, Martin shouted instructions to the remaining passengers, guiding them to the nearest emergency oxygen masks. The living dead grew more aggressive, driven by an unseen force. The passengers, now armed with newfound purpose, banded together to fight off the zombies, buying precious seconds for those trying to secure their air supply. The cockpit's reinforced door held firm, but the window began to crack under the pressure of the relentless pounding from the zombies outside. The captain, face pale with fear, worked the controls with shaking hands. "We're losing altitude," he yelled over the din. "We have to land now." Martin and Claudia looked at each other, their eyes wide with terror. They had no training for this, but they knew they had to act fast. "We need to get everyone to the emergency exits," Martin shouted to Claudia. "Tell them to brace for impact." Claudia nodded, took a deep breath, and relayed the message over the intercom. The passengers scurried through the cabin, some still fighting off the zombies, while others stumbled in panic. The fog had thickened, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. As the living and the dead converged on the exits, the students and captain fought to keep the undead at bay. The plane's alarm pierced the air, adding to the chaos as it signaled their impending descent. On the news, a somber reporter recounted the events of the missing aircraft. The footage of the flight taking off played in a loop, a stark contrast to the horror unfolding in the sky. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, a silent witness to the tragedy. Rescue teams and military vessels were dispatched, but the vast expanse of water made the search seem futile. The families of Claudia, Martin, and the other passengers gathered around their screens, holding on to the faintest hope that their loved ones would be found. The news of the disappearance spread quickly, and soon the entire nation was gripped by the mystery. Theories ranged from a catastrophic mechanical failure to a mid-air explosion. But nothing could have prepared them for the truth that lurked within the fog of that fateful flight.